I run a media company and do web for nonprofits in the area. Right now I'm working for a nonprofit called Accessibility. So we deal with a lot of people that have mental and physical barriers. And so I'm doing a deep dive into web accessibility and what that means for everybody having access to it. So that's my kind of part of today's talk.
My name is Catherine Lundoff, and I'm currently working at Blue Cross. I don't actually do anything with web development, so I'm kind of a ringer at this. My background is in QA and analysis, but I now work in the data warehouse at Blue Cross. I've been in IT in various positions at various companies for about 17 years. And last year I got really interested in the number of articles that I was seeing that were talking about how, all of these women were leaving IT. So I would go to work and look around me and can any of you afford to leave IT? No, I didn't think so. So I got really interested in how we talk about aging, particularly older female-presenting people, but also just aging in general in IT, because the common stereotype is that if you're working in IT, you're a developer, you are young, you are generally male, you're white, or you're of Asian descent, but there's usually not a lot of variety beyond that. We don't often see people with disabilities, we don't see older people, we don't see very many women. And there's a whole range of people out there doing some fascinating work, and I wanted to really start to talk about what that's going to look like. You've also probably seen a lot of the studies talking about how the population is aging. And this is going to be something that has a real impact in IT, because this is markets, this is workforce, this is retaining the people you have, this is training. So there's a whole bunch of different impacts to this. One thing I will say, we compared our PowerPoints last night, and you're going to know the difference between which of us does web presentations and which of us does data.
So I will take an opportunity to plug Google, because Google Slides has material design built into their templates now, so they just make it look pretty. Like, I just typed words, so Google gets the credit. So, but on that topic, 30% of most of our workforces are going to be retiring soon. That's a huge number, and it's changing the entire market of IT. It changes the whole field. So we are in the process of, we need a brand new kind of workforce that is diverse and inclusive and utilizing people's skills. And the great thing about the web is that it is open to everybody. So that's kind of what we'll talk about. After, I'm going to present first, and then Catherine will go, and then if you guys have questions for us, we can just have kind of a few minutes of back and forth, and there's that. I will start. Accessibility is a term that is most generally talked about in the realm of physical or mental disabilities. With the web, it's what sight readers can read on a website, or how people with some kind of disability can interact. I like to think of accessibility on a more grand scheme. People that are low income, like, that's a barrier to technology. It's $12,000 to go to a coder camp. I don't have $12,000 to go to a coder camp. So with my Women in Tech group, we try to make things available to everybody. So it's open source, it's learning from each other, and kind of cohort little groups teaching each other, so it's more accessible. So when I talk about accessibility, I'm not just talking about disabilities or that kind of barrier, but like even cultural barriers to technology. But for stats, it's a lot easier to find statistics about people that have physical or mental disabilities. So one thing we consider is that it's estimated that worldwide 1 billion people live with some form of disability. That's about 15% of the population, and it's with the baby boomer generation aging at the rate that they are, every day that number gets bigger and bigger. And it's not, it's not just disabilities that people are born with. it's things that happen as we age. It's, decreased eyesight, decreased hearing, things that just naturally happen in the progress of getting older become barriers to utilizing technology the way that we do now. So it's something we kind of take for granted, but then you have the people that are born with these barriers that this is their daily interaction. So when we're developing things and we're thinking about these products that we're doing or projects that we're building, we have to try to be aware of all of our users that could possibly be interacting with our stuff. And just know that those numbers increase all the time. I really liked the quote from the W3 that the web is built to be for everyone. It is not just for white men. It is for all of us. And so we have to think about that when we're developing for it. Some of the more common impairments that are out there: blindness, deafness, limited motor skills, limited cognitive functioning. When you're designing something, you may think that it makes total sense how you're navigating it. Your team might think that makes sense, but unless you really put a different perspective into the mix, it might not make sense to everybody. There's some really good organizations out there that will look at your projects and your websites and mobile apps, and they only hire people with disabilities. So they're people that would act like it's a good user base to test with, because they will actually point out things that we might miss as normal functioning adults. So a lot of, for a while there was this really horrific trend of putting that snow effect on everything, where it would go across the screen, and it would make my head spin. So anybody who has a seizure disorder, they probably were hating that more than I was. So it's just little things like that to consider when you're designing. And now, with technology as infiltrated into our systems as it is, there's not much that we don't utilize technology for. You want to schedule a doctor's appointment, you are doing it on some kind of screen. I was talking to a lady from North Memorial the other day. They are eliminating check-in people at their registration desks. So you're going to walk into a clinic, there's going to be an iPad that you check in. My 90-year-old grandma probably will have an issue not being able to talk to someone to get checked in at the doctor. So these are I had a question for her, are you going to have someone available to help people? Because that seems like a huge demographic that's going to the doctor that might not be able to access that. So hopefully they'll address that. North Memorial is a great company, and they probably are all over that. So, but these are some of the decisions that are made in companies every day, and as developers and designers and people building technology, we have to kind of consider those things when we're doing it, because having access to technology is a human right. Everybody might not be on that same wavelength, but the United Nations is, and they're good enough for me. So that would be my some of the common barriers that are found for people that are hard of hearing. Having no captioning on your videos. Google has, you can do the closed captioning through, or YouTube, sorry. It is horrible. If you just let them do the translation, maybe 15% of it is actually what is being said. You can go in and fix it yourself if you're uploading content, so I would highly recommend that you do that. Don't just assume that the robots know what you're saying in your video, actually type it out. Having no ability to control the volume in your app or your project, that's a big one. There's a lot of people that are very hearing sensitive. They either need to make it louder or less, and if you don't let them control it, they can only do so much with their device. The cognitive and neurological having just text everywhere and not having any breakups can kind of overload people, especially on the autism scale. Having grouping things in a way that kind of makes more sense and trying to think about how someone else navigating that might interact with it. Physical, having no keyboard support. So if everything is touch, what if you can't touch? Or what if you need to hit a button with your elbow? You know, just thinking about different things and how you're building your projects. Some apps will rely only on voice recognition. I've seen this as a trend. It's, what if you can't speak? You know, how would somebody interact with your app that way? And then visual, there's a ton of tips for that, just because that's the most common barrier that we talk about when you talk about accessibility and not using contrast and that thing.
Yeah, and one thing with the visual that people don't think of, 10% of men are colorblind.
Exactly, yep.
That's a huge group.
It's a huge group, yeah. And so just taking some of that stuff into consideration when you're designing and building these things will help let more people have access to your projects. So there's really cool stuff on the market that will help people with barriers navigate technology. Sight readers for the blind will go on and just read every word, or if you don't have it coded correctly, it will be confusing, and just read every character. But if you use headers and if you code things correctly in your HTML, sight readers can read a site very easy. Caption videos, adaptable keyboards, so sometimes it's not the tiny little keyboards on your app, but like allowing for an external port or a button or something else. And then there's a lot of Bluetooth enabled hands-free devices that people can use. Shameless plug, the company, the link there is ablenetinc.com. They're a local company that has been designing devices for people with disabilities for about 30 years, and they make some really cool stuff. So if you're ever curious, you can check them out. And then these are kind of my tips for people when they're thinking about how to think about accessibility. When you're designing any project, to have a case study, so you have personas that you keep in mind. You think about the most extreme cases that could possibly, of people that could possibly come up, and then try to design toward that or to include that. And then the age of the user, as people are aging, how familiar with technology are they going to be? How accessible is it for them with their impairments that they may have? Even on the other end of the spectrum, are they so young that they might not, know what you're referencing? That kind of thing. It's just thinking about that kind of stuff. Considering the race and culture of people that will be utilizing your project, you may be using terms that are not sensitive. They might be inflammatory or derogative, and you need to keep that kind of stuff in mind, because just because it's not offensive to you doesn't mean it might not be offensive to somebody else. And then gender. My suggestion is to always develop from a gender neutral stance. We're in the age where it is just not, just don't even bother. Don't even bother. It's they, and be inclusive. And then the income and buying power of your audience. Don't price people out of your project. If we all need to make money, but there are some things that are just exorbitant, and if you really want a lot of people to gain benefit from your project, you have to consider making it price accessible to them. And then accessibility is the ability to access. So what all that means. And one day we will all be out of touch. Like, we're at a tech conference today, but someday we're not gonna know what is happening. youngsters are gonna come in and make all this crazy new technology that we have no idea what it is or what it does or anything. So we need to think about the people that are in those shoes now and try to make things easier for them. Most of the people that I work with that have years and years and years of experience, that's such a wealth of knowledge that we can't download from their brain into ours. So as we dismiss people and we turn people over and we fire people because they're old and we need new blood and all these things, we're losing a huge resource of knowledge from people. The people that come before us in these positions have built these things for us to use. So to just throw them away with the changing times and whatever, it does no good for us. We need to keep that in mind as we need to take from that knowledge and continue instead of just wiping it out and not giving it any credit. Yeah, so my goal is to make technology designed for everyone. And it's not possible to design for everybody depending on what your project is, but the more you can think about that and the more you can work toward it, the better off your project's going to be. So, that would be my spiel. Let's get rid of this. Go into Miss Catherine's.
The only thing I would,
Oh, yeah.
the only thing that I would add to that, to add to your great point, as far as economic diversity,
Yeah.
I can't tell you how many programs or conferences that have happened in Minnesota that have been like for people that were in like the development, not software development, but humanitarian development or other social focused, that the conference is about helping people come out of poverty, and yet the tickets to get into the conference do not offer, they offer a student discount, but they don't offer a discount if you can show like a MNsure
Yeah.
card, for
Yeah.
example, as an alternative to like a student discount. And so just something to consider, which is not.
No, that's
as much
actually, I think,
software.
and Catherine can probably attest to this more than I can, because she's way more involved in the conference world. But I think that is actually a topic that has come up in the accessible conferences and like making these things available for everybody. Like I think that there are.
Especially if it's about bringing people out of poverty and not
Exactly.
having anybody that are, is even.
You're excluding the
or
people
there.
that need
It
that
doesn't-
information.
It doesn't
Yeah.
make sense.
Yeah, so yeah, I totally agree with you, and that's one thing that, like with our group, I like to promote things that are more accessible like that, so conferences like this that are cheaper and more available for people, I tend to promote those more than the ones that cost thousands of dollars. Yeah, but great point. So.
Did anybody else want to ask Valerie any questions? Otherwise, we'll just hold questions to the end. Okay, so I'm going to start off with my portion of this, which is the aging in IT. And for some of you who weren't here before, when we started doing introductions, I've been working in IT for about 17 years at different companies, mostly in Minnesota, and I've worked in a whole variety of roles. And something that I've been seeing is there's kind of a gradual erasure of older people, in particular older female presenting people within tech industries. It's OMG, women are leaving IT. How many times have you seen that headline in the last few years?
Oh, no, yeah.
Yeah, and what I find in my workplace, my friends, my colleagues, the people I associate with, is that it's generally not true. Because for one thing, it's kind of expensive. You just sort of throw your hands up and walk away. I mean, it's a valid choice, but there's a lot of economic decisions that go into that. So I got interested in talking and writing more about how we talk about aging, how we talk about older people within tech fields, and how we talk about that as an accessibility issue. And so this is the first slide. As I mentioned earlier, I work with data, so this is my thing. statistics. The current number of older workers in the workforce, or AARP, is nearly a third of the American workforce is over 50. The number of employees over 65 now outnumbers teenage workers for the first time since the 1940s. For women in the U.S. workforce over 50, 59.4% of the workforce age 55 and older in 2012. They project that 66.6% of the older workforce by 2020. Minnesota alone, between 2020 and 2030, they're projecting that for every one person of working age added to the Twin Cities metro area population, there will be 21 people added over the age of 65. Now, within that, in terms of IT, there's not a lot of information about statistics for IT workers and how old they generally are. A lot of it is anecdotal. Fortunately, Information Week has picked up a few things. They do a lot of scanning of the Bureau of Labor Statistics, but then they do awesome headlines like, "Are you too old for IT?" Thanks. So their breakdown was based on 4.6 million IT positions, and this is a 2012-2013 timeframe. Of that, about 26% are in the 25 to 34 range, 29 are in the 35 to 44, 23 in the 45 to 54, and 12% are 55 to 64. So, generally speaking, when we talk about startups and we talk about large companies out in Silicon Valley and so forth, there's a certain stereotype about what people in tech do. They don't do system support, they don't do QA, they don't do project management, they aren't BAs, they aren't program managers, they're developers. And with that stereotype, we assume that the majority of those people are male, that they are under 30, under 35. They're usually presented as being from a certain socioeconomic and educational background. And we generally, when we talk about IT and we talk about the workforce, we talk about it as though those are the only positions that are available and those are the only people who are working in positions that are relative to IT. And as a lot of you know who've been out and worked in the IT workforce for a while, IT is an infrastructure, it's a framework. There's a whole bunch of things that go into design, into gathering requirements, into development, into managing projects, into doing analysis that aren't necessarily development related, but they are part of IT. And I think it's important to think of IT as more of a big picture. So working anecdotally, so if we're assuming that the majority of older workers who are still in the field are not playing ping pong and sleeping under their desk, which is of course the other stereotype about people who work in IT. A lot of them are in government IT departments and agencies. A number work for nonprofits. And then you have this category, which is very important, because this is something that most startups and most new tech companies don't have, which is established companies with HR departments and policies that promote diversity within the company. This is not necessarily the same as being successful at promoting diversity. But the fact that somebody thought it was important enough to build a department around it is a good sign. And these are important for workers with disabilities. These are important for workers from different cultural backgrounds. These are important for people with different sexualities, as well as older workers. I mean, there's a whole bunch of people who get protected by these. So if you're working for a large corporation that's been around for a while, they've got HR policies that have been sort of fire tested over time, you're generally speaking going to get a somewhat more diverse workforce than you are with a company that started off Kickstarter 3 years ago, because it's a different approach. So within that, what do most older workers do? As a rule, and this is again mostly anecdotal from talking to people, a lot of older men find that they're pushed into management roles. They're heavily discouraged from being involved on the technical levels. And there's a variety of reasons and rationales that go into this. Women get motherly and grandmotherly roles. And what I mean by that is you're expected to have the soft skills to deal with the business. You're expected to have a certain set of skills that enable you to communicate to nurture, to sort of, soothe the social grease so that things function. You're not expected to be a programmer. You're not necessarily expected to be very technical. And in fact, a lot of older women I know were discouraged from this. I once had a manager tell me that that moving into a role that involved more programming was just too technical for me because I had so many people skills. If you haven't heard this one, you will probably hear it at some point. I'm just telling you.
Don't deny your people skills.
There's nothing wrong with people skills. People skills are lovely, however. Those jobs also tend to not pay quite as well.
Right.
It's like saying you can type, so you should be a typist.
Right.
You make great coffee. Oops, that's the other.
I do.
So, and that's a great thing. That's awesome. But maybe you want to try something else once in a while.
Maybe you want to code the coffee maker.
Maybe you want to come to the Now that would be fun.
Right.
So, with that, it's worth pointing out that, these kinds of things are also very dependent on the individual aptitude as well as experience. It's much more common for older workers to get pushed out of tech environments, layoffs, position elimination, other factors that can make IT cultures unfriendly to older workers. And many of them move on to other fields, start up new businesses, or get driven into early retirement. So, which brings us to the skills gap, which is the other thing you get to hear a lot of right about now. There's all these articles talking about, they're on CNN, they're in Information Week, they're in all these publications, they're in Fortune, talking about how the US is facing this monstrous skills gap where we don't have enough skilled personnel to take care of all the various jobs as people die off, retire, all of that good stuff as the economy hopefully expands. And there's a great focus on that. And there's a couple of different schools of thought about the skills gap. Some people think it's very, very real. There are congressional hearings on it. There are many articles talking about ways to address it. There are different kinds of training programs. There's a lot of emphasis on it right now. There's also the school of thought that says that it's an excuse for big companies to bring in more people on H-1 visas. And H-1 visas are a really delightful system that lock people into jobs, which means if they're getting treated badly, they aren't employed. It's very difficult to leave. You pretty much have to leave the country. The visa structure is very restrictive. So it's a system that's rife for abuse. And it also, isn't necessarily using, some of the people who are here who may have some of those skills. And, one of the things that this analyst brought up for Information Week was what we might have is less of a skills gap than a communication gap. We don't have the right people with the right skills finding the companies who are a perfect fit for them, and we have companies who don't know how to attract the right people for the job. And what I thought was really interesting about this quote is if you look at some of the interviews and articles and so forth that have come out, particularly talking about people's experiences with coding boot camps. And they go through coding boot camp, and they go to an interview, and the interview is all whiteboard questions that aren't necessarily asking about practical skills. And it isn't that the person who's getting interviewed couldn't do the entry-level position that they're interviewing for. It's that the way it's being presented, they're being presented with things that are outside the scope of that knowledge. So it's a way to sort of gear an interview away from somebody who you've brought in. So you can say that you're interviewing a wide range of people, but you've actually kind of set things up so that it's a lot harder for that person to get the job. There's been some recent cases. There's a lawsuit pending right now for one of the Silicon Valley companies whose job ads all started with recent graduates only, which is another way of saying you're not really welcome here. So it's a way to sort of mystify the process as well as keeping people out. Why do we care? This would be the no one is 26 forever portion of it. You might be, in which case, hey, more power to you. But legal issues. Age discrimination is in fact illegal. Some of you who are local may remember in 2011, 3M lost a huge lawsuit. They lost a lawsuit because they laid off an enormous number of their senior managers and older employees, and it was very clear that that was what they had done. They just selected whole swaths of their senior employees and just laid them off. And because they were really not particularly subtle about it, they lost a class action lawsuit for it. People in Western nations are retiring at later ages and are working longer when they can, which is something else to consider. When people are talking to you about retirement, we're still talking about a pre-1980s model of retirement, where you are working for a corporation, you are working there for the bulk of your career, you have a pension, and you have whatever other abilities to save, but you're not changing jobs. That world pretty much doesn't exist anymore as we know and love our corporate structure.
Over.
It's gone. Those jobs are so rare. I mean, so rare, it's unbelievable. There's somebody on my team at work who has been there for 45 years. They should encase her in plexiglass because we're never going to see that again. Not that I would wish that, but that's the kind of thing that I saw it when I was first getting into the field 17 years ago. You really don't see it anymore. Most companies have moved away from that model completely. But what that means is that you may hit 65, you may hit 62, and you will not have enough money to retire. Retirement is expensive. Long-term care is expensive. Pretty much everything that goes into aging in this country is really expensive. So it's worth thinking about, saying, well, you can just retire. A lot of people can't, which means, that they are available to work. Accommodations that immediately benefit older workers can also benefit other workers, such as workers with disabilities. And more possibilities for older workers benefit younger workers in the long run. The day will come when, if you last in the field long enough, you will be an older worker in the field. And at that point, you're going to want some of this stuff. It's going to help you too. So why retain/hire older workers? Built-in knowledge base, experience with systems and applications from the ground up. It's the opportunity to adapt tech to a more diverse range of users, create better UIs, different approaches to functionalities, new tech solutions, and marketing those solutions to people from a diverse range of different ages and cultural groups. A diverse workforce is a better understanding of how to reach diverse audiences. And you looked at all those statistics about people growing older. That's a market. That's people who can, in some cases can buy tech, maybe because they're still working on it. But there's a lot of missed opportunity there by ignoring the possibility that you've got people out there who might need a slightly different UI design in order to buy your product. But once they have that UI design, you've got a much bigger market. Older workers are often trained in a wide range of technologies and approaches, and those skills are often transferable from one platform to another. And in general, older workers are statistically less likely to job hunt if companies try to retain them. And what that means is that there's a point at which you think, okay, this is where I want to stay for a while. I want to make this company better. I want to do this job. I'm excited about it, and I want to stay put. I don't necessarily want to change jobs every 2 to 3 years, which is the current estimate of how often people change jobs. And so you've got people who are willing to stay put. And in some cases, it's because they're hoping to retire. I mean, realistically. But that's a lot harder to achieve if you're moving around a lot. So there's some things that prevent that. So I've got a couple of slides here on cultural barriers and physical barriers. Cultural barriers include the assumption that younger is automatically better and cheaper. I will tell you right now, I've been at a lot of large corporations that have done major layoffs. Every single time they've had to bring back a solid chunk of those people because they had a brain drain. They had stuff that wasn't documented, they had stuff that people didn't know how to do, they had older tech they didn't want to upgrade, and every single time I've seen a big chunk of the people who got laid off brought back on again because otherwise they can't operate. So older workers are more expensive and or on the brink of retirement. Older workers have older relevant skills. Older workers require too much accommodation. And the ever-popular older workers are resistant to change. Good times. For physical barriers, you've got things like screen resolutions. And one of the things that I run across, I'm an employee now, but I was a contractor for a long time, is I've worked places where you could not edit the settings on your computer. So you couldn't change the screen resolution. You couldn't change font sizes. I know it sounds ridiculous, but yet it happens. Companies in this very city do this.
Somehow that's a security breach.
Well, who knows what you could do once you change the font? Doom! You know, but it's a thing worth thinking about, is that, you know, that the difference of being able to boost things up to 14 points may make a huge difference in how productive somebody is.
28-inch monitor helps too.
Yeah.
Overhead lighting, there's a lot of glare, and most offices don't deal very well with that. And I think that that's something we'll see change going forward, because it's also a huge energy sink, and it's getting kind of expensive to keep running things that way. Seating and keying and mousing options are often not ergonomic. I have contracted places where they put all the contractors in broken chairs because that's what they had laying around. Where neither the mouse nor the keyboard had any kind of ergonomic function. No keyboard trays. You can't get keyboard trays put in, which also happens some places. Chairs are either not adjustable or actually broken. Good times on that one. Hours and flexibility. Emphasizing required overtime and inflexible schedules makes it harder for older workers and others to retain certain kinds of IT positions. And what I mean by others is people with lives. Aging parents, you know. There is a limit to how productive you are working 10 to 12-hour days all the time. It doesn't matter how old you are, there's a point at which you are too damn tired for anything that you are doing to be very useful. And so to bill this as, we need you for unlimited overtime, we need you to be here all the time, that's a badly run company. That's a problem. Because it should not look like that. Because they're not getting the best from their workers. And it means that somebody has created a series of emergencies through poor planning that is now your problem.
We need you to work all of the hours that every doctor's office in the city is open.
How's that look?
Yeah, that's great.
Well, it might have come from military, which then goes into medicine, which then trickles down.
But the military just sends you during the day, and you just go, and you get taken care of as part of your work. You get to exercise as part of your work too. The military is pretty good.
Interestingly enough, in Germany, they have both a female prime minister and a female Department of Labor minister. And the female Department of Labor minister specifically came out to say, particularly given the advent of cell phones and accessibility to employees that employers have now due to that, that you cannot contact your employees after hours unless it's an emergency or specific to their job, like specific meaning.
They agreed to be on
They
call.
were, yeah, they agreed to be on call, and I think that's pretty,
Yeah, the US is pretty
impressive.
backwards when it comes to.
well, I think it's something of note that this came from female leadership,
Right.
given how much it affects female employees in comparison, given our disproportionate responsibility towards elder and child care.
Right.
Sweden just went to a 6-hour day. I'm thinking of emigrating, I guess. Okay, I just got it.
Immigration.
So hiring and retaining older workers, commitment to creating a diverse workplace, and this needs to include older workers, it should include workers with disabilities, it should include workers from a diverse background, and there's many benefits to this, and as Valerie pointed out during her, I take it back, you pointed it out this morning. There's multiple studies talking about how companies with a commitment to diversity in their workforce do better in the marketplace. They're more stable. Decisions are made longer term. And the fact that you have to get used to communicating with people who aren't exactly like you is a really valuable skill. It helps you, it helps them, but it's also good for the company because it means that you're used to having to work in an environment where everybody is not sort of cookie cutter. Providing training options for all workers. Better seating and lighting can reduce turnover and sick time due to repetitive stress injuries. Promote mentoring to help older and youngers work together. Don't pre-screen older workers in the application process, and don't assume that a skill can't be transferable if a job candidate is a good fit on other levels. And finally, some thoughts for actual older IT workers, because this is something, that I do see. Staying open to change by working with and learning from younger colleagues as well as your contemporaries is very useful. Keep your resumes and skills up to date. Learn to network. This is a thing I see a lot in companies that I've been at that have been going through layoffs, and there will be people who've been there for a very long time and they don't know how to use LinkedIn, and they don't know really how to use the web, and they don't know that there are groups out there that they can go and talk to. And in a lot of cases, this is because these were things that didn't exist when the last time they were job hunting. So they literally don't know how to do it. And that's a huge barrier. I mean, if you want to stay in a tech field, that's a huge problem. And some of that is things that people can learn through asking questions and so forth and training, but it's also worth thinking about that, if you're in a position where you're at a company where you're handling the layoff end of things, that it's a whole lot gentler to make sure people know how to do that kind of stuff. Soft skills are your friend. They love you. They want you to be happy most of the time, or guilty, as the case may be. Periodically assess your skills and your long-term goals, and assume that nothing is permanent. Because again, permanent jobs are not really permanent jobs, and I think that, because we learn to think about it, if I get this job, I can be there forever. Really? It's so rare. And finally, it's also worth thinking about, if you've been laid off, if you've been downsized, if you've decided to leave a company, that it's worth, if you can take the opportunity to assess a new position based on how they fit you, which is kind of outside of the notion of cultural fit. It's cultural fit for you too. And I think that's a thing that, particularly more experienced workers in tech need to also think about. Is, a lot of times, people are getting screened on their way in for cultural fit, but the cultural fit and how you can handle it and how it works for you is also very important. And it's worth remembering that part of the lack of permanence that we have in the tech workforce benefits you to an extent that you can, to some extent, pick and choose where you want to be. I realize the last few years have not been a great representative example of that. However, there were still people who were still working in tech and who were still able to change jobs and so forth. So it's worth thinking about it, or at least considering whether or not it's an option for you.
Well, I think a good point to that is, like, you can interview the company. They have a culture that you need to fit into too. So figuring that out, like, it's not just about them selling, or you selling yourself to them. Like, they need to sell themselves to you too. So it has to fit both ways.
I find that companies have what they say they are and what they turn out to be are very different. And I think
Totally.
There's a party line, and
Yeah.
so
Well, and that's why going to things like this and networking and being in groups will help that, because then you're meeting people that are actually working in these companies and you can get the real scoop
if they
on,
tell you.
right,
Depends how
on
good the
how,
party's on
Sometimes
is,
when
yeah.
you interview, you can actually ask to meet the people that you'll be working with. too.
Yep.
Like ask for a tour, ask to actually meet the members of your group and like see what it looks like.
and if they don't let you do that, there's a problem.
Well, they let you do that, but how many people, when you're walking around with HR, or you're walking around, are actually going to tell you outright, this is a horrible choice?
No, but you can kind of like see how people are at work, like do they look.
Sometimes.
They'll give you the
I
secret
think-
code,
I think
like,
usually, yeah, I think
Look for the dead eyes.
right, dead eyes.
sometimes.
Yeah, sometimes.
Usually I ask
I
about
lean
the
toward
turnover
the
rate,
meetup
that's
solution.
usually my biggest. If the guy shakes your hand, he says, yeah, I've been in the industry for 5 years, and he looks like he's 60, then it's probably a stressful environment.
Unless he actually is.
But
Job change.
yeah, job change. I see people in their 40s and 50s changing, but the turnover rate is what I go for. Because if I see a job where they're turning over every 2 or 3 years, and it's not something I would expect to turn over like that, that's what you don't want to be there.
To your point, I do want to say, 'cause I've had the experience, and I know 2 other women in tech companies that have had this experience where they did go work for a large corporation that did have HR policies, but because they did not have any HR presence on site, like the guys are using the women's bathroom and they could make all the complaints they wanted, but it didn't really matter because it was just 2 steps closer to where the lab was. So, other things of that nature occurred with little support. So if you are looking for actually HR to be a real support, it's important that there's a representative on site that's not just your supervisor's secretary.
Especially with outsourcing, like a lot of companies are outsourcing for HR now, so it's
Yeah.
much more difficult to get any support.
That's even more true.
Yes.
Not a question, but I just want to provide another example of accessibility. A friend of mine was in a rafting accident a few years ago, and he lost all movement below his shoulders. And it's been really interesting to see how he's been able to use technology to still do things day to day. He's actually got a mouth guard that's connected to a pointer, and then he uses that for the iPad and iPhone. And he can do an amazing amount of things with that. But then it's interesting to see when some apps kind of go out of their way to make UIs fancier, but at the same time completely
So
you
difficult.
can't do
Yeah.
certain things if they're too advanced. You can do the pinch to zoom, you can do some multi-select stuff and have great accessibility, but if you're reinventing the wheel to the point where you're not adhering to their accessibility standards, people aren't going to be able to use your app. So it's important to think about that in design and development as well.
I had an interesting discussion with the co-founder of Augusto this morning. We were talking about the possibility of haptic feedback and how that could be built into accessibility, because if you're only able, like, let's say you're blind, but you can feel the haptic feedback, like if you go over a button, like that's where it'll tell you where that is. So there's a lot of possibilities if you just think about some of these new technologies that are coming out and how they might be utilized in other ways. So it's about perspective, just thinking of other perspectives. So that's super cool though, that the mouth guard. There's so many different assistive technology things that just blow my mind all the time.
The other thing that I read an article recently that was thought-provoking, and it was written by a woman who runs a startup. And she said, it's some comment to the effect of, I didn't really consider the need for diversity in tech until this happened, which was, when she hires on a tech person, she also has the other departments that would be working with this tech person also interview them just to see if they can cooperate well. And as a result of that, they had more women and people of color on the hiring team. And had those people not been in the room, the candidates that they chose not to hire would not have made some of the comments that it turned out to be a guy, but he made, and they would have hired him otherwise. But because they had a more diverse hiring team, those aspects about that person's values came out sooner.
It's a great point.
So something to consider if you're hiring.
Anybody else have questions or anything? Other comments?
So here's some interesting articles that talk a little bit about how things are changing. Fortune and NBC are actually also talking more about aging in tech and what that's going to look like. There's a few things from Technology Review.
Just a suggestion for next year, maybe. Let's have one for the millennials, dealing with millennials, so it's kind of fun.
That's a whole other ball of wax.
I know, I love it.
I do have another question. What?
Entitlements.
I have a background as a classically trained mechanical engineer, and so one of the things that I find really great about the software side is because you can have standalone skills. So unlike, say, in actual physical infrastructure, where you have bids and contracts and a lot of paperwork that can be geared towards women or people with a soft skill kind of thing. Like if you're hired as a developer, nobody's going to give you like a stack of forms to fill out as much as actual coding. And I also see a lot of opportunities for entrepreneurship more so because the technical tools that you need just are not as expensive as like an advanced manufacturing facility. So what kind of opportunities for entrepreneurship are there for like older people, since we're aging, or people that have, the accessibility aspects of things, where you see that happening, you see that as an advantage, even though, being an entrepreneur in and of itself takes a lot of hats, just out of that.
Well, it's not just the hats. I mean, some people have definitely managed to make that work. You've got people who started their own companies, you've got people who are doing app development, you've got a whole range of different things. I think there's an organization called Model View Culture, which is a website that has a lot of articles about promoting diversity in tech, and they usually get at least one person per issue talking about how they started up, like a startup, where they got resources and so forth. But there's startups and there's startups. And startups are very dependent on venture capital. That's the model that we work on. The vast majority of the people who get venture capital for a startup are in a very small demographic category.
There are some organizations that are working
There are
to
some, but
fix
they're
that, but
also
it's
new.
Right,
So that's
right.
still building. So I think that we could have that same conversation 5 years from now and it will look different.
right.
But yeah, there are a number of folks who have managed, left tech fields and gone on to start up businesses, gone off and done, a whole range of other things. So I think that there's a lot of things that we learn from working in tech that are applicable to other things. If you spend enough time doing it, the ability to do big picture thinking and analysis is awesome. It's just super useful to just about anything else you want to do. So I think that there's a lot of opportunity for people to go and apply some of those skills to other things. I do have to ask though, is there another kind of mechanical engineering training besides classical? Because I think it would be.
Oh, just like that, you can. So, I just meant like I have a 4-year degree, so you can be like a designer, for example, like a designer position. You don't have to have a 4-year degree for it, and you may have the same career trajectory, and over time, But I don't have my PE, so some people would not consider me an engineer because if they're more on the software side of engineering, and then there's people that have just like a 2-year degree that are. So that's why I just.
Thank you for clarifying, because I would have been waking up in the middle of the night.
What does that mean?
yeah, meaning like I went through the traditional means, but that's not necessarily the only way that you can acquire the skills.
So yeah, I think that, to your point, I think that there's several new venture capitalist companies that are focusing, on women, on bringing more people of color into the field, on enabling startups. And so I think that that'll be a gradual shift over time, but a lot of them are still very new.
It's like 95% young white males. Like venture capitalists right now, like all the bias, all the sexism, all that stuff is really bad right now. It's one of the worst areas of tech to be in group. So it's changing. There's a lot of people working on making it better, but right now it's
We need overhaul.
better.
Overhaul.
Yes.
But we actually, the other thing, a lot of people don't have access to, the more traditional venture capital structure is crowdsourcing.
Yeah.
And I think that's probably the single biggest area in which there are more startups that are. But again, you've got a certain amount of how do you access that audience that can give you that money? How do you present what your product is so that you have some kind of long-term life for it? So there's other things that go into it.
Yeah, I would just think on the software side, there's more opportunity for project work, which of course has its pros and cons because it's the beginning and end. But you don't look as much like a job jumper. If you have a positive experience with a company, you can continue to work with them on the next project. And if you don't really care for their values, but you get along well enough, and you finish the project, you get a good recommendation, and you find a company that might be a better fit. Where otherwise, if you're in a traditional role, on some level, they do expect you to be there for 2 years plus, and then you might be under that same manager.
This is the reason we do a lot of consulting and project work because of that.
Yeah.
If it's not a good environment, you can move.
Yeah, and I see a lot
easily.
more opportunity in software for older
Absolutely.
people, for women, for minorities that are still living into that right